The Deadly Price of Cutting in Line, True Crime Story. Hook. What happens when you cross the line? In a world where time has no meaning and every step you take pulls you deeper into an endless void, one man dares to cut in line. But the price is far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. Stay with us until the end, because you'll never look at waiting in line the same way again, and the line doesn't end, not for anyone. The line was long, stretching out of sight. The air smelled like cheap perfume and stale coffee. A buzz of impatience ran through the crowd. He was at the back. It had been a long day, but he was finally here. The line moved slowly. Too slowly. His eyes scanned the others ahead of him, one by one. Then he saw it, the man in the front. He was taking forever. Something about him, slow, deliberate, irritating. Minutes passed. He glanced around. The people behind him were starting to murmur. He shifted his weight. Impatience crept under his skin. He couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, just a little. His foot nudged ahead. A bold move. Just one step. Then another. He was in. The man in front didn't notice. He was too focused on his phone. The crowd was distracted. But one person saw. A voice from behind, low and steady. You cut in line. The words didn't register at first. He kept moving forward. But the voice came again. This isn't your place. Something in the tone sent a shiver down his spine. He stopped. The crowd was quiet now. His heart raced. He turned, scanning. The voice came from a woman in a dark jacket, her eyes cold and unblinking. Her gaze held him for a moment longer than comfortable. Then she smiled. A thin, chilling curve of her lips. He swallowed. The hair on his neck stood up. Go back, she said. There was no anger in her voice. Only the calmness of someone who knew exactly what would happen next. A strange pressure hung in the air. The line had grown silent. He hesitated. Then a sudden realization hit him. The man in the front was still oblivious. But the crowd wasn't. They were all watching him now. And something wasn't right. His legs felt heavy. Like they were sinking into the floor. The woman's smile remained. But her eyes, they weren't friendly anymore. They were predatory. His throat tightened. He should have stepped back. He should have left. But it was too late. The ground beneath him seemed to shift. His legs gave out. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance. But the crowd, they didn't move. No one even blinked. The woman took a step forward. Her shoes made no sound on the floor. Only the soft hiss of air. He felt a chill run through him. A cold that reached deep inside. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. You should never cut in line, she whispered. The words weren't loud. But they felt like a command. He tried to back up, but his body refused. A strange force held him in place. The others were still silent. Not a single sound, not a breath. The only movement came from the woman. Her hand reached out slowly, like a shadow. He couldn't move. His muscles were frozen, stiff. The crowd didn't even flinch. They just stared. And then, she touched him. Her fingers were ice cold. Like death itself had pressed against him. He gasped, his breath hitching in his chest. The cold spread, seeping through his skin, down to his bones. His heart began to race wildly. Panic bubbled in his throat. Please, he whispered. Her smile grew, colder than before. Too late, she said. The room seemed to close in. The walls pressed in on him, tighter and tighter. The air was thick now, suffocating. He wanted to scream. But his voice was gone. His legs gave out completely. He fell to the ground, helpless. The woman stepped back, watching. The crowd, still silent, waited. Time stretched, thick and suffocating. Then the door opened. A figure stepped in. A man, dressed in black. He moved through the crowd, like he didn't even see them. He was looking at the woman. You've taken too long, he said. The woman didn't answer. She just nodded. The man stepped forward. He crouched down next to the fallen man. The eyes of the crowd flickered, like they had been holding their breath. The man in black stood. A soft, almost gentle hand rested on the shoulder of the man who had dared to cut. And with one swift motion, the man in black twisted. The sound. A crack. The man's body went limp. His head drooped. And the crowd? They began to move again. Like nothing had happened. The woman's smile never wavered. She turned, as if nothing had just occurred. As if the man who had cut in line wasn't lying there, lifeless. The crowd began to murmur again, but softly. No one seemed to care. No one seemed to notice the sudden change in the air. The man in black straightened up. He glanced at the woman, then at the body. Without a word, he walked out the door. The woman stayed behind. She surveyed the scene one last time. Then she followed him, disappearing into the crowd. The door clicked shut behind them. The line resumed its slow crawl. But the air felt different now. Thick. Heavy. Like something had shifted. Like there was something darker waiting in the shadows. No one spoke of what had just happened. No one asked why the man had been dragged away. And no one questioned the stillness in the room. But everyone felt it. The unsettling tension. The weight of what they had all just witnessed. It clung to them, suffocating them in silence. The man who had cut in line was gone. But no one was sure if he had truly disappeared. Or if something else had claimed him. The next in line stepped forward, almost hesitantly. But the unease was palpable. His eyes darted around. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air. Like something was watching. Waiting. It didn't take long for the tension to break. The line moved again. And the world continued, but it was no longer the same. Something dark lingered just beneath the surface. And everyone felt it. The next few minutes passed in strained silence. The line moved a little faster now, but no one was in a hurry. Everyone was looking around, uncertain, as if afraid to blink. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder. More oppressive. A woman ahead of him fidgeted with her purse, eyes darting. He felt it too, the tension, the weight in the air. Something was wrong. The atmosphere had changed since the man had fallen. But it wasn't just the crowd. It was him too. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had noticed him. He took a slow step forward, eyes scanning the faces around him. The woman who had spoken to the man, the one who'd smiled that chilling smile, was gone. But he still felt her presence. Like a shadow trailing him. He quickened his pace, trying to ignore the pounding of his heart. But the closer he got to the front, the worse it felt. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He kept glancing over his shoulder. No one seemed to be paying attention to him. But the air still felt heavy, like it was pressing in on him. He reached the counter. The clerk behind it didn't look up. She was staring at the register, her fingers frozen over the keys. A chill ran down his spine. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice distant. He swallowed hard, trying to sound normal. He felt it then, the final break, the thing that had been pulling at him from the very beginning. A shift in the air, a moment of truth. This wasn't just a line. It was the end. And it had claimed him. He looked back one last time, but the room was gone. The door. The people. All of it, swallowed by the line. And as he stepped forward, the darkness welcomed him. His mind shattered into pieces. And the line, endless as it was, kept moving. The darkness swallowed him whole. It wasn't just a void, it was alive. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as if it were pressing in from every side. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't scream. The line stretched endlessly in front of him, an infinite corridor of shadows and faces. Faces that weren't human anymore. Faces that were empty, like masks, hollow eyes, blank stares, and lips frozen in silent screams. He tried to look around, but there was no up, no down. No left, no right. Just the endless line. His legs moved automatically, dragged by an unseen force. He wasn't walking. He was being pulled. And with every step, the world around him seemed to twist and stretch further into the abyss. His body was no longer his own. The line had consumed him. And now he was just another face. Just another figure in the endless parade. He tried to fight it, tried to break free, but it was futile. His arms were heavy, his chest tight. Every breath felt like it was the last one he would ever take. And then, he saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the line. A face. His heart skipped a beat. It was the man who had cut in line before him, the one who had fallen. But now, he wasn't lying on the ground. He wasn't lifeless. He was standing. And his eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them. Only emptiness. The man's mouth moved, but no sound came. It was like he was trying to speak, but his voice was trapped in the void. The woman, the one with the chilling smile, was standing behind him, watching. Her eyes gleamed, but they weren't filled with amusement anymore. They were filled with something darker. Something far older. Something that knew no mercy. The man in front of him was staring ahead, frozen in place. And as he stood there, his body began to fade. The edges of him blurred like smoke. Like he was evaporating into nothing. And then, he was gone. The line moved on, relentlessly. He looked ahead again, and the faces continued, empty, lifeless, all of them waiting. Waiting for what? For their turn? Or for something worse? The woman's presence lingered behind him, like a shadow that could never be shaken. She was always there. Watching. Waiting. And now, it was his turn. He had crossed the line. And there was no going back. The darkness closed in around him. The line stretched on, an endless spiral. And in the deep, suffocating silence, he understood. This was his eternity now. This was his fate. The line never stopped. It never ended. And neither would he. The darkness thickened, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't feel his own body. He was weightless, suspended in some endless void. The line was gone. The faces were gone. There was only the silence. That oppressive, suffocating silence. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't calm. It was hollow. Cold. Like he was trapped inside a vast, empty room with no walls, no floor. Nothing but a creeping, endless nothing. Then a sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. But it grew louder. Closer. A low, rasping breath. A figure emerged from the shadows. Slowly. Relentlessly. At first, he couldn't make it out. But then, the outline sharpened. It was the man who had cut in line before him. The one who had fallen. But he wasn't the same. His face was gaunt, hollow. His eyes were black, no pupils, no light. There was nothing in his gaze but an endless, inescapable void. The man took a step forward, but his feet didn't move. He glided, hovering, as if the ground didn't touch him. His lips parted, but no words came out. Just a faint rasp. The sound of something breaking. Then, his mouth opened wider. Wider still. And the darkness poured from his mouth. It wasn't like smoke. It was thicker. Heavier. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something worse. It was alive. It crawled over him, suffocating him, wrapping around him like 100 icy fingers. The man's eyes burned blacker, emptier. And then, the woman appeared beside him. Her smile stretched impossibly wide. Too wide. The edges of her lips cracked, as if they couldn't contain the smile anymore. "You're part of it now," she whispered. Her voice was sweet, but it held a finality. An inevitability. She didn't need to say more. He understood. He was no longer in control. His body wasn't his anymore. His thoughts weren't his. He was just another part of the line. Another empty shell. A cog in a machine that ran on endless suffering and silence. The man who had once cut in line was now part of it, too. A faded memory. A husk. No different from him. No different from anyone who had crossed. You'll learn soon enough, the woman continued, her voice echoing in his mind. Everyone does. It's always the same. The man, the one who had fallen, took another step forward. And as he moved, his body began to dissolve. Pieces of him crumbled away, like ash in the wind. But still he moved. Still he glided forward. Toward the line. And as the line stretched on, he realized. There was no end to it. There was no beginning. Only the endless march. Endless waiting. Endless silence. And as he felt his body fade, he knew. He had crossed the line. And now, he was nothing. Just like the others. And he would never leave. Never again. The line stretched on, endless and unyielding. He didn't know how long he'd been walking. Hours? Days? Or had time itself unraveled the moment he crossed? The faces around him, hollow, vacant, never changed. They stood, trapped in the same place, the same frozen moment, just like him. It was as if the very air had been sucked from the world, leaving only shadows and cold. And yet, the line continued. The endless line. He could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. Each step forward was a struggle, his feet dragging as if the very ground beneath him fought to keep him in place. But there was no escape. The woman had gone. The man had vanished. The weight of their eyes, their presence, still lingered. But now, it was only him and the line. And the silence. The silence was louder than anything he had ever known. It was the kind of silence that filled every corner of the world, every part of him. It was deafening. He looked to his left, then to his right. Everyone around him was exactly the same. Blank faces, eyes forward. Not a word. Not a sound. And then, as if summoned by the silence itself, the whispers began. At first, they were just a faint murmur. Like voices carried on the wind. But they grew louder, clearer, until they were all he could hear. You're one of us now. There's no way out. You crossed the line. The words slithered through his mind like serpents. He tried to shut them out, but they only grew louder, more insistent. You are the line now. He stopped. His breath shallow. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt. He couldn't feel his body anymore. I just need a ticket. The clerk's eyes flickered up, locking onto his. She didn't blink. Her expression didn't change. He felt like she was staring straight through him. His pulse quickened. He cleared his throat. But she still didn't say anything. He started, but her eyes were unblinking, unrelenting. It was too much. He had to get out. He turned to leave, but as soon as he did, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The crowd jolted, startled. He spun around. The clerk was still standing there, her hands on the counter, unmoving. But now, her eyes, they weren't just cold. They were hungry. Her lips parted into a slow, sinister grin. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, her voice so quiet it barely reached his ears. His throat went dry. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. And then, before he could move, he saw her. The woman. Standing in the doorway. The same smile. Her eyes glinted with something dark. Something that didn't belong. And that's when he knew. It was too late. The line was never just a line. The woman stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The room seemed to freeze. No one moved, no one breathed. Her gaze was locked onto him. Her eyes never wavered. They were dark, empty. The silence grew unbearable. His throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but no words came. The crowd behind him was silent. Still. Frozen. They were all staring at him now. As if they were waiting. Watching. He tried to take a step back. But his feet wouldn't obey. He was stuck. Rooted to the spot. The woman was closer now. Her smile stretched wider. It was unnerving, unnatural. Like it didn't belong on her face. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air. Do you know why they wait? He couldn't answer. His mouth felt dry. His chest tight. Everyone waits, she continued, her voice soft, almost melodic. Until they're called. He wanted to scream. To run. But his body refused. She reached out slowly, her fingers like ice. They brushed against his cheek. His skin tingled with cold. Something ancient, something wrong, surged through him. He was no longer just afraid. He felt trapped. Why? He managed to croak, his voice barely audible. The woman's grin widened. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light. Because they know, she said softly. Once you've crossed the line. Her hand touched his chest. It wasn't just cold. It was suffocating. He felt the air around him grow thick, heavier. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, warping, spinning. The figures around him, the people in line, had changed. Their faces were blank now. Hollow. Eyes empty. The man in front of him, the one who had taken forever, was gone. Replaced by something else. Something worse. The line wasn't just a line. It was a test. And now, he had failed. Her fingers dug into his skin, pressing into his chest. Welcome to the end of the line, she whispered. And in that moment he understood. The door was locked. And there was no way out. The weight in the room grew unbearable. Like the very air itself had turned to lead. His heart hammered in his chest. Every breath felt shallow, desperate. Her fingers were still on him, icy cold, digging deeper. It wasn't just a touch anymore. It was a grip. A pull. His vision blurred at the edges, the room spinning wildly. The faces of the people around him, they were no longer human. They were hollow, like mannequins, eyes lifeless. He could hear their breathing, slow, rhythmic. But it was wrong. It was too synchronized. Too perfect. And the woman, she wasn't just watching him. She was waiting. Waiting for something. His legs were shaking now, barely holding him up. But he couldn't move. His body felt frozen, like it had been locked in place by invisible chains. The woman leaned in closer. Her lips barely moved as she spoke. Do you feel it? He tried to nod, but his head felt heavy. Like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But the line, it held him in place. Do you feel the line? She whispered again. And suddenly he understood. It wasn't just a line of people. It wasn't just a place. It was a boundary. A border. A threshold between something, other. The people around him weren't just waiting. They were trapped. Bound by something they couldn't escape. They were waiting for their turn to cross. To pass through. To disappear. The line stretched beyond the room. Beyond the door. And when it was your time, when they called your name, you crossed it. And you never came back. Please, he gasped, finally able to speak. But she didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her smile widened even more, stretching across her face. The edges of her lips turning upward, impossibly far. It was like the darkness behind her smile was alive. Like it wanted to swallow him whole. Your turn is coming, she said, her voice dark and hollow. And before he could even process what was happening, the world around him shifted. The walls seemed to dissolve, the people fading into nothingness. The floor beneath him trembled. And then, the line wasn't just in the room. It was everywhere. It stretched into eternity. And he was part of it now. A part of something endless. Something he could never escape. The ground beneath him buckled, and for a moment, he thought he was falling. But he wasn't. He was sinking, slowly, into something cold and unseen. The line stretched before him, a never-ending series of faces. Eyes staring blankly, empty of all life. He wasn't sure how long he'd been standing there, how long he'd been trapped, but time had lost all meaning. The line was all there was. It twisted and turned, stretching into a void that seemed to consume everything around it. The woman was still there, watching him from the edges, her eyes glinting with something dark. She didn't speak now. She didn't need to. He felt the pull again. A tug from within the depths of the line. His body moved without his consent. He tried to resist, tried to fight it. But his feet dragged forward, step by step, as if he were being pulled by invisible threads. The others in the line, those around him, didn't move. They remained still, their hollow eyes locked ahead, like they were already lost in the same path. He reached out to one of them, a woman standing just a few inches away, her face pale and lifeless. Her skin was cold to the touch, like stone. Her eyes flickered for a moment, locking onto his, and he saw it, recognition. But there was no emotion in her stare. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink. Her lips moved slowly, forming words he couldn't hear. He pulled his hand back, dread settling deep in his chest. The line was endless. It stretched far beyond sight, a dark horizon that seemed to fade into the void. He had no idea where it ended. Or if it even had an end. There was no escape. The coldness was starting to seep into his bones, deeper than before. He wasn't just trapped in this line, he was becoming part of it. A cog in the machine. His heartbeat grew louder, but it was fading, becoming more distant. Like he was sinking into the very floor beneath him, into something more terrible than he could ever imagine. And the woman, she was there, watching him, smiling that same chilling smile. But now, it was different. Now, he could see it in her eyes. She wasn't waiting for him to cross the line. She was waiting for him to break. It wasn't just him walking now. It was the line moving him, pulling him toward the unknown. He glanced ahead, a flicker of something up ahead, movement in the shadows. Then a voice. A familiar voice. "Welcome home." He turned, his heart pounding in his chest, but all that greeted him was darkness. And in the distance, the faintest echo of the line, stretching forward, without end. And he knew. There was no end. No escape. The line had consumed him. And he was part of it now. Forever. And the line never stopped. It just kept stretching into eternity. He was no longer sure if time had any meaning here. It felt like years, or maybe just moments. The distinction didn't matter anymore. There was only the line. The faces around him, their hollow eyes staring blankly ahead, their bodies motionless. Yet they were still there, still part of the line. He was too now. He could feel the cold, the emptiness, seeping into his soul. It was more than just isolation. It was the quiet acceptance of his place in the endless procession. The line had become his reality. His world. And the further he walked, the more he understood. There was no reason to fight. No reason to look back. No reason to hope for anything beyond the next step. It was all the same. All part of it. He wanted to scream. To run. But that desire faded as he kept moving. As if the line had begun to shape him, to erase the person he once was, replacing him with something else, something that no longer questioned, no longer sought answers. "You crossed the line," a voice whispered, just behind him. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the man. It wasn't anyone he recognized. It was simply the voice of the line itself. A quiet murmur of truth, buried in the suffocating silence. He didn't need to turn around. He didn't need to see who was speaking. Because he knew. He was part of the line now. His heart still beat, but it was distant. As if he were slowly detaching from his own body, becoming one with the shadows around him. The line stretched ahead, a never-ending horizon of still faces, waiting in their endless loop. And then, in the far distance, a faint flicker of light. A doorway. It appeared as if from nowhere. He slowed, his steps faltering. Could it be? Could there be an end? A way out? But the closer he got, the more he felt it. The light was not salvation. It was just another part of the line. And as his feet carried him forward, he knew. There was no end. No escape. Only the line. And now, he was part of it forever. The line had no end. It was the only thing that remained, Asterisk asterisk. End.